Okay. Well, thank you for coming. Thanks for taking time out of your evening on this lovely cold Wednesday to learn about Hemlock woolly Adelgid. I'm the Invasive Species Project Coordinator for the Finger Lakes Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. We've been running this volunteer program for a couple of years, and it has been steadily growing, so we're really glad to see that. So I'm just going to kind of give a general overview of Hemlock's HWA and how to participate in the program. It's pretty easy and straightforward. But first, I like to just give a overview about the Finger Lakes PRISM itself. So New York State is divided up into 8 partnerships for regional invasive species management, with the Finger Lakes PRISM being the largest. So we are a partnership between the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Finger Lakes Institute at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. So our headquarters are right here in Geneva at the tip of Seneca Lake. And our working area is larger than every other PRISM. It's about the size of New Jersey. We encompass 17 counties, so that is a lot of area for our very small staff to cover. So having volunteers to kind of supplement our data and go and survey where we can't, because obviously we can't be everywhere at once, is really helpful and really important for determining how HWA is spreading and just invasive species in general, so that we know kind of which areas need to be addressed and might be at risk in the future. So before getting into HWA specifically, invasive species in general, I just kind of like to get everybody on the same page. So the definition that we use for invasive species is any non-native species that causes harm to the environment, economy, or human health. It can be really difficult to predict ahead of time which species are going to become invasive when they get introduced, because non-native species are getting introduced to new environments pretty much every day in different ways, but they don't all end up becoming invasive. The ones that do tend to share some common characteristics, those being having a high reproductive rate, very aggressive behavior. I really like to use eastern gray squirrels as an example for this, because they are pretty big and mean, and while they're native to us here in the eastern US, they are very invasive in the UK and Ireland. And so because they're so big and mean, in comparison to the native squirrels that they have there, they've really managed to overpower them and displace them, and they're a big problem. Having no natural predators and a similar climate and latitude, so they come from invasive species that we have here typically come from Europe and Asia, because they've got that similar like 4 seasons, more temperate climate. So it feels just like home to these species, but there's nothing trying to eat them all the time and keeping their numbers down. But a really big, kind of the most important one of these common characteristics is that invasive species are great at taking advantage of human disturbance. So along trails or forest edges in agricultural areas, even like suburban neighborhoods and like urban areas, all of that disturbance from humans, it's really difficult sometimes for native species to kind of repopulate areas where they have been displaced by our activity. And that creates the perfect opportunity for invasive species to move in once they've been introduced and kind of overpopulate, while native species are in a more weakened state, I suppose. In terms of how this happens, there are a lot of ways that non-native species get introduced and eventually become invasive. And when I say that it can be intentional or accidental, intentional doesn't mean someone brought it in with the hope that it would cause some sort of harm. It just means that it was put into that new environment on purpose because we like it, it's useful to us, many other reasons, and then it just became out of control. So released pets are a big one. Goldfish in particular, a parent is tired of taking care of their kid's goldfish and they want to be humane, so they release it into the wild, but it's not supposed to be in that environment, so it ends up growing out of control and preying on all of those other fish that are meant to be in that aquatic environment, and it ends up doing more harm than good. A lot of our terrestrial invasive plants start as like medicinal plants or landscaping plants, so they're valuable to us visually or health-wise, and they survive very well. Stuff doesn't eat them, but then nothing's keeping them under control, so they spread. And then some accidental introductions, escapees, so Burmese pythons down in Florida. I'm sure everybody knows all about those. But pet mills being destroyed during Hurricane Andrew led to Burmese pythons escaping and becoming invasive. And then hitchhikers, which is, I would say, arguably the ones that we talk about the most at the PRISM, invasive species, attaching to people's watercrafts or equipment between the treads of your shoes or on your clothes, just kind of getting picked up without people realizing and then dropped off somewhere else. We have a lot of species that have gotten introduced in that way. And HWA is one of those. So we'll get a little more into that. But it's really important to remember, even though there are all of these pathways for them to get introduced and a lot of species getting introduced all the time, that they are really the exception and not the rule. So we have something called the TENS rule, which is that only roughly 10% of non-native introductions are actually able to survive in that new environment. And only 10% of those survivors end up becoming invasive. We have plenty of non-native species that just kind of hang out and do their own thing and don't really cause problems for anybody. And in fact, that's the majority of them. But that small percentage that does become invasive has, a disproportionate impact. So those categories of harm that I mentioned before, the environment, economy, and human health, when we look at kind of those environmental damages, invasive species are the second largest threat to biodiversity behind habitat loss, but also causing like physical structural changes in the shape of the environment, disrupting like natural processes, ecosystem functions and services, all things that the environment provides to us and other wildlife that live in it. Invasive species can throw all of that off. Economically as well, though, they can be pests in agriculture and disrupt, trade and production. Recreation, if people can't use recreation areas, that has an economic impact. And also just the cost of management in general is very expensive after a certain point. But human health as well. As our soil and water and air quality declines, so does our well-being. But some species, directly rather than indirectly cause harm or injury or disease. So if anyone's encountered wild parsnip or giant hogweed before, those are a very good example of how they can cause direct harm. And so kind of putting all of these into an actual number, the United Nations estimates that there's roughly $400 billion spent on invasive species control every year. That estimate was from the last couple of years, but it has quadrupled every decade since the 70s. So it is exponentially growing. And this figure on the right is kind of how we visualize that, along with how we visualize an individual species progression as well. So, in a perfect world, we would know exactly which species are going to become invasive. We would know what we can do to prevent them, how they would get in. But unfortunately, that's not possible. We're not psychic. So we try to do a lot of work as much as we can in the eradication part of the curve, where there's still a very small number of populations, and we could feasibly get all of them out, and hopefully it would be like it never happened. But that's typically not that's not how it really goes for a lot of species, unfortunately, because the public doesn't really become aware a lot of the time of new invasive species until the containment stage. So we're not going to be able to get them all out of the area, but we can kind of keep them to where they currently occupy. And what we really want to avoid is getting into this big, very tall part of the curve, asset-based protection and long-term management, because that's the point kind of where we are with like emerald ash borers, where all the damage is done. There's nothing that we can do about it. Now we just kind of have to pick up the pieces and try to preserve what we can. But HWA is down here kind of in this containment stage, and in some areas still a little bit in eradication. And we would like to keep it there if we can. But so getting more specifically into HWA, it stands for Hemlock woolly Adelgid. This is what it looks like when a tree has an infestation, but something earlier on might have only one or two of these little puffballs. So the scientific name, Adelgis tsugai, it's native to Japan, potentially other parts of East Asia, but we know for a fact that it comes from Japan, and the populations that were brought into the US came from Japan as hitchhikers on horticultural imports. It was first recorded in the eastern United States in Virginia in 1951, but it has existed on the West Coast for much longer. Farther back in like California, farther back towards like 1920, and more in the Pacific Northwest, even longer than that. But HWA adults themselves are very, very small, like about the size of a poppy seed or smaller. So you can't, when you're looking at a hemlock branch, you can't see the adult itself, but you can see this little house that it builds for itself, which is that fluffy white ball. And that is what they use to protect themselves from the weather and kind of hold their eggs onto the tree. And a really interesting kind of part of their biology is that they feed on a lot of other species of trees out like in their native range, but here we only have eastern hemlocks that they prey on. Because we don't have a specific species of spruce tree that is native to Japan, they can't complete the part of their life cycle that leads to males developing. So we only have females in the United States, and they can reproduce asexually through a process called parthenogenesis, where they basically just lay a bunch of genetically identical eggs and clone themselves, which means, unfortunately, that even just one adult female getting into a forest can mean the downfall of that hemlock forest eventually. HWA infestation can kill a hemlock in as few as 4 years. Typically, it's between 4 and 10. And we can't really prevent them from spreading because they're so small that the eggs and adults just kind of get blown by the wind or picked up by birds inadvertently and moved between areas. So this is what they look like under a microscope, this teeny tiny little bug. And this is the kind of damage that they can do that is a little farther south from us. New York State, as we move farther north, doesn't have quite as much damage as some areas farther south, but the Catskills, for example, have been totally wrecked by HWA. Just for a comparison on their size, this is what the crawlers, the adults, look like in comparison to a penny. So, like I said, very, very tiny. And then up close, these are the eggs, and you can kind of see, I don't know how well it comes across on the Zoom, but that darker area is some of the adult because they wrap themselves up in this white bundle. Once they start feeding on the sap of a hemlock, they actually don't move for the rest of their life. They kind of pull their legs in and they just stay there and then leave this little house around themselves. So just to kind of visualize their progress throughout the United States, on this map on the left is, you can see right here, that county in Virginia where it was first discovered. And it has steadily been moving north and south throughout the range of eastern hemlocks. It just recently, you can see in this map on the right, in the last couple of years, started making its way into Canada. And part of the reason that it's kind of taken so long for it to get into these farther north areas is that it used to be too cold for HWA to survive and thrive up there. But now with climate change, as we're getting, shorter, milder winters, temperatures just are not getting low enough for long enough to be able to kill them off. And so that protection that used to be offered by the cold is no longer offered. So areas farther north are much more at risk than they were before. But you can see here that the Finger Lakes, all of our counties, except for Madison County, it has not been found there yet. I don't know how likely it is that it's not there, but our volunteers haven't found it. The state hasn't found it. But every other county in the Finger Lakes region does have HWA to some extent. Monroe County has had it for the longest. Typically, it starts in cities because people will bring things to these like larger centers of commerce. And then they spread outward from there. But clearly it's on the move, and that's part of why we want to stop it, because eastern hemlocks are really, really important. So I mentioned emerald ash borer before. Emerald ash borer is obviously a huge disappointment. It's very sad that we lost the number of ash trees that we did. But there are other hardwoods that can fulfill the same ecological niche that ash trees provide. With eastern hemlocks, that is not the case. They are very unique and valuable. And if we were to lose them, there would not really be anything that we could do to replace that. Part of it is that they provide such dense shade from their needles that no other conifer provides. That is very important for regulation of soil and water temperatures and humidity, and like maintaining kind of stable environment. But also hemlock roots are very shallow and widespread and kind of twisting. And so they provide a lot of erosion control and like runoff mitigation. And they tend to grow on slopes where other trees might not be able to grow, and also closely along streams. And so they do a lot for protecting our water quality. I'm from Rochester, and the Hemlock Lake is the water source for the city, and it's completely surrounded by these steep slopes covered in hemlock. So if those were all to get infested with HWA and eventually die off, there would be a big problem for the city of Rochester, because all that runoff would start going into the water, and we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to deal with that. But also several native species rely on these services that eastern hemlocks provide to survive. So brook trout, that shade from the dense canopy, maintains very cold water temperatures in spring and fall, where it's not necessarily cold enough from just the weather, but there's no like deciduous trees are not providing shade either. And so they need that very cold water to carry out their life cycle. They're also our state fish. Hellbenders and other species of salamanders rely on the humidity and temperature control in the soil that hemlocks provide. If you didn't know, the eastern United States has the greatest salamander biodiversity of anywhere in the world. So lots of important, unique species that we want to protect. And then there's also this species of mushroom called Hemlock reishi that only grows on hemlock wood. It doesn't grow anywhere else. And it has been found to have a lot of really important medicinal benefits, and it's currently in clinical trials. And this is just a couple examples of those species that rely on eastern hemlocks, but obviously many more do as well. So we have to do kind of everything that we can to prevent eastern hemlocks from declining farther. And there are a couple things that we can do depending on the situation. For smaller infestations that are kind of more manageable, pesticides are very effective treating HWA. So in New York, we have 2 pesticides approved. They're often used in combination with each other. Imidacloprid is slower acting. It doesn't offer immediate protection in the same way as the other chemical, but it lasts longer, so it doesn't have to be applied as frequently. And this can be applied as a basal bark application or through a soil drench. And then dimethoprim is the other chemical, which is a lot faster acting and provides more immediate protection, but it has to be reapplied a lot more frequently, like every year or 2. And this can only be applied as a basal bark application. And because basal bark applications can only be done by licensed pesticide applicators, that one that's available as a soil drench, imidacloprid, is the only thing available to private landowners, like on their own. But if you have hemlocks on your property, if you think that they might have HWA, or even just as a preventative treatment, I would strongly encourage you to work with a licensed pesticide applicator, because once a hemlock has been infested with HWA, there is not really anything that can be done to save it except treatment with pesticides or biocontrol species. So this is more applicable for larger populations that, we wouldn't necessarily be able to get to every tree in like a hemlock forest, or we would end up kind of hitting species that are not the target with pesticide treatments. Biological control is just introducing a natural predator that feeds on HWA in order to reduce their numbers. It can't eradicate it in the same way that pesticides can, but it can at least give the trees a better chance and help to restore some balance. So in New York State, kind of the leading body on that is the Hemlock Initiative Biocontrol Lab. They're part of Cornell, and they have been researching 2 biocontrols, these black Laricobius beetles and 2 species of silverflies. For several years now. We're a lot more careful just in general with biocontrols now than we used to be, because before, there were a few cases of we introduced something without really testing it, and then it becomes a worse invasive than what we wanted it to control. But these have been very thoroughly researched, and they're not currently available for public purchase, but they're under evaluation to see, how well these species have established, and releases are being done into the environment. So they may be out there already reducing populations, and we just don't know yet. There was another biocontrol that was researched more in the 90s. This beetle down here, Sissagesimnus, it is available for public purchase, but it is really not effective. It will feed on HWA, but it doesn't necessarily survive very well through the end of the season. So the two that are very promising are Laricobius and those silverflies. And just this is from the Hemlock Initiative, I think closer to the end of last year, just a little bit of mapping of where they've released some populations and how far they have dispersed. So they're starting to establish, which is very promising, and hopefully that will take some of the burden off of our region in regards to HWA. But in terms of what you can do as just an average person, surveying is really, really important. And while prevention is the most effective way to combat invasive species, with HWA, we can't do that. So we do the next best thing. So by surveying for HWA, that's how we, figure out where it is right now to the best of our ability. And then we identify areas that are at risk, maybe adjacent or like high value ecological areas, so that proactive treatment is possible. And so just collecting this information and making it available to the public and other environmental professionals better equips us to be able to do that. And HWA's life cycle also makes these months, December through kind of the beginning of April, the best time to survey for HWA, because it's really the only time that they're visible to the naked eye. So if you were wondering, like, why are we going out in the cold? It's just because trying to find them any other time is going to be very difficult. They've got these 2 generations per year. It's kind of cool how they work. The spring generation, sap is available from the hemlocks the entire time. So they're able to rapidly progress through their life cycle without any pause in their development. But the overwintering generation, which is the one that we're looking for right now, they start feeding in like the middle to late summer. But then as the hemlocks bring their sap kind of back down to the roots to prepare for winter, the crawlers that are from the overwintering generation will go into estivation. And then when sap becomes available again, they'll wake back up, and that happens around December, and then start feeding and build those shelters around themselves to protect from the cold and wind and snow. And so later in the year, you can sometimes see those white shelters left over from January, February, March time. But a lot of the time by then, they've kind of started to degrade, making right now when we really have to be out there. Does anyone have questions before I get into hemlock identification?
Not right now, thanks.
Great. So hemlock identification, you're going to need to know how to do it if you're going to survey for HWA. It's really easy. Personally, I am terrible with hemlock identification, or not hemlock, with tree identification in general, but hemlocks make it really easy. So I appreciate that from them, because their needles, bark, and cones are all very unique and pretty difficult to mix up with other conifers. So starting with the needles, they're very short, like a 1 inch approximately, or less. And they've got these 2 white lines on the underside, which really kind of stand out. And the needles are also flat, so if you roll them between your fingers, they're not going to be able to like roll smoothly. And they also grow out of the sides of the branch instead of all the way around. And they have these alternating twigs. So when you compare that to other conifers that we have in the region, pines, they have those round needles and they're very long. If you roll them between your fingers, like they'll roll around no problem. And then spruce, shorter needles, but kind of this more like blue color, and they grow all the way around the twig. And they're round as well, but hemlocks look pretty strikingly different because of that flat appearance and growing out of the sides only. And then the bark is this really nice dark brown color. It doesn't really have any deep ridges or furrows. But what I like about it a lot is if you get up close and you pull off a piece of the bark, it's got this rich purplish red color on the inside, which no other native species in or native tree in our range like has this trait. So that makes it stand out especially. And then the cones are not a ton of help in the winter unless they just haven't fallen off from the previous season, but they're about the size of like a dime to a quarter. They're the smallest cones of any conifer. So it's pretty hard to mix them up when, other conifers have cones the size of your hand. And And then when you're looking at HWA on a hemlock, you're going to want to look at the underside so you can see those two white stripes because this is the underside of the branch. And HWA will be feeding at the base of the needles because the new growth is the easiest for them to access sap. And they have just these white puff balls. They kind of look like perfect little balls of lint. And if you look really closely, you can see a black dot in the center, and that's the bug itself. But so making sure to look on the underside and look for those. There are some things that look kind of like HWA, but they're not typically. So like spider eggs will typically be kind of bigger. There's something called a needle miner that feeds on hemlocks, but the webbing that creates is more flat and spread out and doesn't really look like this. So it shouldn't be too hard to mix up with other stuff. In my experience and everyone else from the program, it's pretty easy to find. But if we're all good on that, I'll move into talking about how to survey for HWA using the app. So if you open up Survey 123 and hit continue without signing in, at the search bar at the top of your My Survey 123 screen, just at the end of that, hit that little QR code button and scan this code right here. Hopefully it's big enough. And just let me know when you've done that.
Yep. Got it.
Great.
All set.
Awesome. So when you first scan it, I think it opens the survey form. But if you back out of that and just go to the survey information page, to record an observation, just hit collect. If you close the app or the app crashes or something, it'll save that survey in your drafts. And if you are recording your observations, out in the middle of nowhere with no internet access, that's fine. You'll still be able to submit it later. You just save it to your outbox, and then when you have connection again, go into your outbox and submit everything that's in there. And you can't go back and edit surveys after they've been submitted, but you can go and look at them if you want a reminder of where you've surveyed before. So all of your observations are going to be recorded in Survey 123. We used to use IMAP invasives, but we've transitioned over. But if you have an IMAP invasives user ID and you happen to know it, you can include it in the form because all of this data does end up going into IMAP because that's our statewide database. And having your ID makes it a little bit easier to transfer that over, but you don't have to worry about it if it just doesn't apply to you. So we ask that you record an observation at a minimum of 2 sites of your choice before April 1st. Our program ends at the end of March. But you can survey as frequently as you like. You can do once a month or every other week, whatever you want to do, as long as you get at least 2 sites during the survey season. And these surveys are aggregate, so you don't have to survey every single tree that you find. You just submit one survey for areas of about 50 hemlocks. But so if you can, maybe try to avoid surveying just like one single tree in your backyard and try to find an area that has more hemlocks if that's accessible to you. And also indicate whether the survey is on private or public property, just so we know whether it is something that would be accessible to us if we were to go, or some other environmental professional were to go and survey that area as well. A quick note about survey location. Survey 123 automatically records your location. You don't have to do anything, but you might get this little yellow warning. That just happens if your GPS coordinates aren't super accurate. You can hit this little crosshair button to try to get the app to record more accurate data, but we don't want anyone to be limited by their device capabilities. So if you can't get this to go away, that's totally fine. You can still submit your survey. So when you're reporting, taking your observations, we want 3 criteria. whether or not you found HWA, we do still want you to submit observations if you haven't found it. So if you've searched that area of roughly 50 hemlocks and you haven't found it, just indicate that to us, because it's nice for us to know that someone looked and not just have to assume. Average tree size, that's kind of how we gauge like the age of the stand, and then stand health based on canopy cover, because hemlocks that are suffering from HWA will have a more thinned out, less healthy canopy than untouched hemlocks. And again, not for every single tree. So when you're doing like average tree size and stand health, don't just look at one individual, kind of lump all of the ones in the area together, and don't include like the canopy cover of other species, just focus on the hemlocks. And also take a good picture of the needles that you're looking at, including if you don't find HWA, as long as it's like up close and in focus, because we have to be able to confirm that you're looking at a hemlock, that you're looking at HWA in order for it to get submitted to IMAP. So just nice up close focused pictures. So just for measuring average tree size, we don't need you to take like the DBH or anything. It's kind of approximate. So if these are mostly large trees, you can't really wrap your arms all the way around them. Mostly medium, you can wrap your arms around, and then mostly small, you can wrap your hands around. And if there's not really any dominant size class, just say it's mixed. One really interesting thing about hemlocks is that you can tell that a hemlock stand is not doing so well if there are a lot of like seedlings and smaller trees, because they tend to choke themselves out sort of with that very dense shade that they cast. And so normally if sunlight can't hit the forest floor in a healthy stand, there won't be a lot of young hemlocks. But if it's getting through and allowing those seedlings to grow, that means that something might not be so healthy with that stand. And then needle loss, again, just kind of approximate in these 20% intervals. This is hard to show in a PowerPoint just because tree branches get messy, but hemlocks tend to, when they're dying from HWA, the damage tends to move from the bottom up. So healthy hemlocks have this like nice full green look, and hemlocks that are kind of on death's door very far along in the process will have like a top heavy appearance, and the green needles will pretty much only be at the top. Sometimes right before the hemlock dies, the needles at the bottom will bounce back a little bit, but for the most part, they get very top heavy looking. And so just kind of estimating what percent on average of all of the trees, what percent of the needles are still intact. But that's everything. Hopefully it's straightforward and easy, doesn't give you too much trouble in the field. Thank you again. I'm going to pause the recording now so that we can talk about some questions. But if you have any questions later on, just reach out to Beck Anderson at hws.edu. That's our PRISM coordinator, Sam, and he can help you out.
Okay.